"Any man would be lucky to have you," Luke said, and he meant every word. Abigail Harper turned. She looked at him the way a woman looks at someone she has waited on for far too long. Not angry, not hopeful, just tired of waiting. "Then why," she said quietly, "has no man ever stayed?" The words didn't come out like an accusation. They came out like a door finally closing. Luke Grayson stood there with grease on his hands and sawdust on his boots, and for the first time in his life he had absolutely nothing to say. If this story already has your heart, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now and stay with us until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. Luke Grayson had fixed 100 broken things in his 32 years on this earth. Busted fence posts, split wagon axles, barn roofs that sagged so low a man had to duck walking through his own door. He had a reputation in Dry Creek Valley for being exactly that kind of man, the kind who showed up without being asked, who worked without needing to be thanked, who stayed until the job was done and then quietly went home. He was good at fixing things. He was terrible at saying what he felt. That afternoon in late June had started like any other. He had been riding back from the Miller property where he'd spent the morning patching a section of their north pasture fence when he spotted the Harper wagon sitting lopsided at the edge of the road that ran alongside the schoolhouse. One wheel had come off clean. Not cracked, not bent, just clean off like it had finally decided it was done cooperating. Abigail was kneeling beside it in the dust, her skirt tucked under her knees, trying to wedge the wheel back onto the axle by herself. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for help. She was simply working the problem with the same calm, methodical patience she brought to everything in her life. That was the thing about Abigail Harper. She never expected rescue. She just figured out how to get by. Luke pulled his horse to a stop and climbed down before he'd even made a conscious decision to do so. "Let me get that," he said. She looked up, brushed a strand of dark hair away from her face with the back of her wrist. "I almost have it," she said. "I know you do." He crouched beside her. "Let me help anyway." She hesitated the way she always did, that brief, almost invisible moment where Abigail Harper assessed whether accepting help would cost her more than doing it herself. Then she nodded and moved aside. They worked together in silence for a while, the way two people do when they've known each other long enough that silence is comfortable. Luke wrestled the wheel back into position while Abigail held the axle steady, her fingers steady and sure. When the pin was back in place and the wagon sat level again, Luke stood and wiped his hands on the rag he pulled from his back pocket. Abigail rose beside him, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Thank you," she said simply. "Anytime." They stood there a moment. The summer heat pressed down on everything. Somewhere in the schoolyard, a couple of sparrows were arguing over something in the dust. Luke was thinking about heading home. He had his own fences to check, his own supper to cook. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and the thing that had been living in his chest for years, that quiet, stubborn, patient thing he had never once given a name to, pushed itself right up to the surface. "Abigail," he said. She turned. He meant it as a simple observation. Something kind. Something true. "Any man would be lucky to have you." He said it the way a man says something he genuinely believes. Not as a compliment fishing for reaction. Not as a hint hidden behind plain words. He said it like a fact, the same way he'd say the sky was wide or the summer was long. He expected a smile, maybe a quiet laugh. Maybe that little wave of her hand she did when she was brushing off a kind remark. Instead, Abigail went very still. She looked at him. Not the quick, polite glance of someone accepting a compliment. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you have been holding something for a very long time and have finally decided you are too tired to hold it anymore. "Then why," she said, her voice low and steady, "has no man ever stayed?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Luke opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because the answer he would have given, "Oh, I'm sure the right man will come along," or "those other fellows just didn't know what they had died," before it reached his tongue. Because he understood in the span of a single heartbeat that she wasn't talking about other men. She was talking about him. The way she was looking at him, the steadiness of it, the lack of anger in it. This wasn't a woman scorned. This wasn't a woman throwing an accusation. This was a woman who had been waiting with more patience than any person should ever have to spend, and she was simply quietly finally telling him the truth. He had been the man. All along. And he had been too blind or too afraid to be anything other than useful. Abigail held his gaze for 2 full seconds. Then she looked away down the road toward home, and her expression closed like a window being shut against weather. "Thank you for the wheel, Luke," she said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and drove away without looking back. Luke stood in the road for a long time after the dust settled. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling of his cabin and went over it again and again, the way a man keeps pressing on a bruise to understand where exactly it hurts. Has no man ever stayed? He thought about what he knew of Abigail Harper's history, with men, which was not much because Dry Creek Valley was a small place and people talked, but Abigail never did. She was private the way mountains were private, not secretive exactly, just self-contained. As though she had decided long ago that her interior life was hers alone to manage. He knew there had been a man named Robert Caldwell who courted her when she was 22. Robert had been a decent enough fellow who worked at the land office, and for about 6 months, everyone in town had assumed they'd be married before spring. Then Robert got offered a position in Cheyenne and took it. He said he'd send for Abigail once he got settled. He never sent for her. Abigail went on teaching school. There had been a rancher named Pete Weston when she was 25, a widower from the next valley over who had 2 small children and needed a capable woman. He'd courted Abigail respectfully, brought her mother gifts on Sunday visits, and seemed sincere. Then his brother offered him a partnership in a cattle operation out in Oregon, and Pete took his children and went west. He wrote a letter of apology. 1 letter. Then there had been Thomas Hale just 2 years ago, a school teacher from back east who had come to Dry Creek to visit his cousins and stayed for a season. Educated, thoughtful, soft-spoken. The most serious of the 3 by all accounts. He and Abigail had taken long walks in the evenings. The whole valley watched with something like hope. And then his mother fell ill back in Pennsylvania, and Thomas went home to care for her. He too promised to return. He too never did. 3 men. 3 departures. 3 promises that evaporated like morning frost once the sun of convenience warmed them sufficiently. Luke had watched all of it from a careful, respectful distance. Had told himself each time that it wasn't his business. That Abigail was capable of navigating her own life. That she didn't need him inserting himself where he hadn't been invited. But lying in the dark that night, he understood what he had actually been doing. He had been a coward, dressed up as a gentleman. He rode to the general store the next morning on the pretense of needing nails. Martha Greer, who ran the store with her husband and knew the business of every soul in the valley, looked at him over the counter with that particular expression she reserved for people who were fooling themselves. "You look terrible," she said. "Sleep poorly." "I'm fine." She set his nails on the counter. Abigail Harper came in this morning, bought flour and lamp oil, and didn't say 2 words more than necessary. Martha paused. She had that look. What look? The one she gets when she's made up her mind about something. Luke placed his coins on the counter. Made up her mind about what? Martha studied him. I don't know, but she was checking the stage schedule on the board by the door. A pause. The Eastern stage, twice. Luke left without the nails. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Abigail Harper had lived in Dry Creek her whole life. She wasn't going anywhere. She had her mother to care for, her school to run her life here. One conversation beside a wagon wheel was not going to send her fleeing across the territory. He told himself that all the way home. He told himself that through breakfast. He told himself that while he was mending the stretch of fence along his eastern pasture, the one that had needed attention for 2 weeks, and that he kept finding excuses to delay. He was still telling himself that at noon, when Caleb Reed rode up on his gray horse and helped himself to a place at the fence line beside Luke without asking the way old friends do. Caleb was 41 and had been ranching in the valley even longer than Luke had. He was a straightforward man with a sun-weathered face and the habit of saying precisely what he thought at the exact moment he thought it. "You hear about the schoolteacher," Caleb said. Luke kept working. "What about her?" "Word is she wrote to her cousin up in Billings. Possibility of a teaching position there." Caleb hammered a staple into the post. "Her mother's sister lives up that way. Might make sense if she was thinking about a change." Luke straightened slowly. "Who told you that?" "Martha Greer told my wife. My wife told me." Caleb shrugged. "Small valley." Luke was quiet for a moment. "It's probably nothing," he said. Caleb looked at him with the flat patience of a man who has watched a friend be obtuse for too long. "Luke," he said, "how long have you been half in love with Abigail Harper?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "You rode 3 miles out of your way every Sunday for the last 4 years to pass by the road that goes by her farm. That's a reasonable route. It adds 40 minutes to the ride home." Caleb went back to hammering. "I've ridden it with you." Luke didn't say anything. "Now," Caleb said, "you can stand here and help me pretend we're talking about fences, or you can go figure out what you actually want before the decision gets made for you." He drove in another staple. "Either way works for me." Luke went home that night and sat on his porch for a long time. He tried to think clearly about it, the way he thought clearly about practical things. He tried to assess the situation the way he would assess a broken piece of machinery, identify the problem, identify the repair, execute. But this wasn't a piece of machinery. This was Abigail Harper, who had been a constant in his life for 8 years, who had helped him write a letter to his mother when she was ill, and he didn't know how to say what he meant, who had shown up quietly with a covered dish when his old ranch dog died, which was a thing he had never told anyone, because it embarrassed him how much that gesture had meant, who laughed at exactly the right moments and never laughed at the wrong ones, who had built a life out of steadiness and dignity and love for the people around her quietly, without requiring anyone to notice. What he felt for her wasn't simple. It wasn't a young man's rush of feeling, the kind that flares bright and burns fast. It was something that had grown slowly in the dark, the way roots grow deep and stubborn and structural. He hadn't built it intentionally. He hadn't tended it deliberately. It had simply grown year by year through 8 years of proximity and attention and unspoken understanding. And he had done nothing with it. Not because he didn't care, because he was afraid. Afraid of being one more man who got it wrong with her. Afraid of stepping wrong and losing the friendship, losing the Sunday conversations at the fence by the creek, the easy collaboration during harvest season, when half the valley helped the other half, the quiet mornings at church, when they sometimes ended up sitting a few rows apart, but always caught each other's eye during the sermon, and communicated something wordless and real. He had protected the friendship by burying the feeling, and in doing so, he had become exactly what she described. Another man who had never stayed. Not because he left, but because he had never fully arrived. 3 nights later, he was at the Hendersons' barn for the summer social, the informal gathering the valley held every year in late June, when the hay was in and the worst of the planting was done, and everyone needed an excuse to breathe. He wasn't planning to go. He generally avoided these things. But Caleb's wife, June, had told him point blank that if he missed it, she would consider it a personal offense, and June Reed was not a woman whose personal offenses you invited without good reason. He arrived late, which suited him. The barn was full and warm and loud with fiddle music and conversation. Tables along one wall, children running between people's legs, old ranchers arguing about rainfall amounts, Mrs. Patterson playing her usual territorial game with the dessert table. He saw Abigail almost immediately. She was standing near the far wall with her friend Clara, talking quietly. She was wearing the blue dress she wore for Sunday church, and she had her hair pinned back more simply than she usually did, and Luke didn't have language for it. She looked like herself. That was all. She looked precisely and completely like herself. And that was the most beautiful thing he could think of. He was working up the slow, uncomfortable courage to walk over and say something he didn't know what, but something real, something beyond pleasantries when the door opened behind him. The man who walked in was well-dressed in a way that announced money without shouting it. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had made his plans and was accustomed to them working out. He scanned the room with the unhurried manner of a man who was used to entering spaces and being noticed. His eyes found Abigail Harper. He didn't look away. Luke watched him walk directly across the barn, holding a small bunch of wildflowers he had clearly stopped to pick on the road, a gesture so deliberately casual it was anything but, and extend them toward Abigail with a smile that could only be called charming. "Miss Harper," the man said loudly enough for Luke to hear from where he stood. "Nathan Caldwell out of Denver. My cousin George told me I had to make your acquaintance while I was passing through. I can already see he was right." Abigail took the flowers. She smiled. Not the polite practice smile she gave to strangers. A real one. The surprised kind. The kind that came when someone caught you off guard in a good way. Luke put down his cup of cider and walked quietly out of the barn into the night. He stood in the cooling air and pressed his hands flat against the worn wood of the barn wall and breathed. He had waited years, and in the time it took a stranger to walk across a room, he understood with absolute clarity that years were not infinite. He rode home alone. He lay awake again, but this time it wasn't confusion keeping him up. It was something colder, something that felt the way an untreated wound feels when you finally stop ignoring it, sharp and focused, and demanding to be dealt with. Nathan Caldwell, from Denver. With flowers and confidence and the easy manner of a man who saw something he wanted and moved toward it without apology. Everything Luke had never been with her, not because he lacked the feeling, but because he had convinced himself that staying quiet was a form of respect, that waiting was a form of patience, that holding back was a form of care. But standing in the dark outside that barn, listening to the fiddle music and the laughter inside, Luke Grayson understood something he couldn't unknow. Silence isn't respect if it leaves someone alone. Waiting isn't patience if the other person doesn't know they're being waited for. And the man who holds back, no matter how good his reasons, is still a man who's not there. Abigail had told him the truth beside that wagon wheel. She hadn't been cruel about it. She hadn't even been angry. She had simply said what was true, in that steady, clear way she said everything. Has no man ever stayed? He had heard it as a question about other men. It was a question about him. And the answer until this moment had been no. He lay in the dark and decided that was going to change. He didn't know how yet. He didn't know what he was going to say, or when, or whether it was too late. He didn't know if Nathan Caldwell from Denver was going to sweep in and give Abigail the certainty she deserved, and the life she'd postponed long enough. But he knew this. He was done being the man who stayed quiet because it was safer. He was done fixing everything around her life while leaving the most important thing broken. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, Luke Grayson let himself want something out loud, even if only in the private dark of his own mind. He wanted Abigail Harper. Not as a neighbor, not as a friend, as his. And he was finally, after all this time, willing to say so. He was up before dawn, not because he had slept and woken early, because sleep had never come. He had lain in the dark, turning the same thoughts over and over until the sky outside began shifting from black to the deep, uncertain blue that comes just before morning admits what it is. He dressed. He made coffee. He drank it standing at the window and watched the light come up over the eastern ridge and told himself he was going to be practical about this. Measured. He was not going to do anything rash. He was going to think it through. By 7 o'clock he had saddled his horse and was riding toward town without any clear plan whatsoever. Practical. Measured. That had lasted approximately 40 minutes. The truth was, he didn't know what he was riding toward. He only knew that lying still wasn't something he was capable of anymore. 8 years of stillness had apparently reached their natural limit somewhere between the barn social and 3 in the morning, and now his body was simply moving because staying in one place felt like something he could no longer afford. He almost didn't see Abigail until he was nearly past her. She was on the road ahead of him, walking, not riding walking, which meant she had left early enough that she hadn't bothered with the wagon, and she was moving at the brisk, purposeful pace she used when her mind was occupied with something specific. She had a basket over one arm, and her head was slightly down, and she was clearly in no mood to be interrupted. He slowed his horse to a walk and came up alongside her. "Morning," he said. She glanced up. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, not quite wariness. Something more complicated than either. "Luke, you're out early." "I have bread for Mrs. Alvarez. Her hip has been bad." She kept walking. "You're out early too." "Couldn't sleep." She didn't ask why. That was Abigail. She never pressed for what you weren't offering. But he caught the slight shift in her jaw, the almost nothing tightening that told him she had registered the answer and was choosing to let it pass. He climbed down and walked beside her leading his horse. She didn't tell him not to. They walked in silence for 2 minutes. Comfortable silence was something they had always had. Except this morning it wasn't entirely comfortable. It was the kind of silence where both people are aware that something was said recently that changed the geography between them, and neither one quite knows yet how to navigate the new terrain. "About what you said," Luke started. "Luke, let me say it." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "I've been thinking about what you said since Wednesday," he told her, "about no man staying, and I want you to know that I heard it. Not just the words. What was underneath them?" Abigail looked at him steadily. She had the kind of self-possession that took years to build, the kind that doesn't crack easily, but that if you looked close enough, showed you exactly where the cracks had been repaired. "It wasn't meant as an accusation," she said. "I know. That's actually what hit me hardest." He looked at her. "You weren't angry. You were just telling me the truth." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she shifted the basket on her arm and looked down the road. "I shouldn't have said it," she said. "It wasn't your burden to carry. What if I want to carry it?" That stopped her. She turned and looked at him with something careful in her eyes. Not hopeful, not closed off. Something suspended between the two, the expression of a woman who has learned through specific and repeated experience that hope is a thing you spend carefully. "Don't say things you don't mean, Luke." "I mean it." "You mean it right now," she said quietly. "You meant it when you said it." "That's not what I was talking about." She paused. "I'm talking about months from now. About what happens when life gets inconvenient. About the difference between meaning something in a moment and choosing it when choosing it costs you something real." He didn't have an answer for that. Not a quick one, not a clean one. And Abigail watched him not have the answer, and something in her expression softened, not with satisfaction, but with the particular tenderness a person shows when a thing they suspected has been confirmed. "I'll see you Sunday, Luke," she said. She walked on. He stood in the road with his horse's reins in his hand and watched her go, and for the second time in 4 days, he found he had nothing to say. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like a challenge. He started paying attention differently after that. Not watching Abigail, he had always done that in the careful peripheral way of a man who doesn't want to be caught. But paying attention to what he had been allowing himself not to see. The things he had catalogued as simply the way things were, without asking why they were that way, or whether they should be. He noticed that Abigail's porch steps had needed replacing for 2 seasons. He knew because he'd noticed the soft spot in the second step the previous fall, and thought vaguely that someone should get to that. Then filed it away and moved on. He noticed that her wagon's left rear wheel, the one he'd replaced on the pin just days ago, was not the first time that particular wheel had given her trouble. Caleb's wife June mentioned it in passing the way people mention long-standing facts. "Oh, Abigail's always fighting with that wagon," she said. "Her father's old rig. She won't replace it because it was his." He noticed that every Sunday after church, when people paired off naturally into families and couples for the walk home, Abigail walked with her mother. Always her mother, because her mother was the family she had, and Ruth Harper was a gentle, quiet woman who leaned more heavily on her daughter's arm each passing season. He noticed that Abigail was the first one to show up when someone was sick and one of the last to leave. That she organized the school fundraiser every spring almost entirely alone. That she tutored 3 children in the valley for free because their families couldn't pay. That she had quietly, without announcement, been holding significant portions of this community together with her bare hands for the better part of a decade. And nobody, including him, had thought to ask what she needed. He rode to her farm on a Saturday morning with the intention of replacing the porch steps. He hadn't called ahead. He simply arrived with lumber in the back of his wagon and knocked on the door. Abigail opened it. She looked at the lumber. She looked at him. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "I know." "Luke, the second step is soft enough to break through." He held her gaze. "I'm not doing it because I think you can't manage. I'm doing it because I should have done it 2 seasons ago and I didn't, and that's on me, not on you." A long pause. Ruth Harper appeared at Abigail's shoulder, her face brightening immediately. "Luke Grayson, what a nice surprise." Abigail let the man work. Abigail looked at her mother, then back at Luke, then at the lumber. "Coffee's on," she said finally, and stepped aside. He worked through the morning while Abigail graded schoolwork at the kitchen table inside. Ruth came out twice with coffee, and once with a piece of cornbread, and both times she lingered just long enough to say something kind and observant about Luke's character, in that gentle, pointed way older women deploy when they are actively engineering something they consider overdue. At noon, Abigail came out with a plate of food and sat on the finished steps while he cleaned up. They ate without talking much. Just the sounds of the farm around them, a horse shifting in the paddock, the wind moving through the grass, the distant call of something in the field. "You don't have to keep doing this," Abigail said finally. "I know. I mean it. I don't need—" She stopped, started again. "I've managed." "You have," he said. "Better than most people would. I'm not saying you couldn't." He set down his plate. "I'm saying you shouldn't have had to do so much of it alone." She looked at him. "That's a different thing," she said carefully. "I know it is." Another silence. But it was a different kind of silence now, not the cautious suspension of their morning conversation on the road, but something more like the silence that falls when 2 people are standing at the edge of a conversation that matters, and neither one quite has the footing yet. "Nathan Caldwell stopped by the school on Friday," Abigail said. Luke kept his expression level. "Did he? He asked if he could call on me Sunday afternoon." She looked down at her plate. "I said I'd think about it." "And have you thought about it?" She was quiet for a moment. "He's straightforward," she said. He doesn't make things complicated." "No," Luke said. "I expect he doesn't." She looked at him then with those clear, careful eyes. "What does that mean?" "Nothing. Just agreeing with you." "Luke?" Her voice was quiet but direct. "Don't do that. Don't agree with me and mean something else. You've done that for years. Say what you mean or don't say it." He looked at her. She was right, and they both knew it. "I think," he said slowly, "that a man being uncomplicated is not the same as being right for someone. I think there are things that are worth the complication." He held her gaze. "That's what I mean." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and picked up her plate. "He's calling Sunday at 2, she said. "Thank you for the steps, Luke. They're sturdy." She went inside. Luke sat with the weight of that and said nothing because there was nothing left to say, not yet. But he noted that she had told him. She hadn't needed to, and he filed that carefully away. He showed up at her farm again the following Thursday with the expressed purpose of looking at the barn roof, which June Reed had mentioned in passing was letting in water on the northeast corner. Abigail was at school. Ruth let him in with undisguised delight. "She'll be home by 4, Ruth said, settling into her chair on the porch with her mending. "I'm just here for the roof." "Of course you are." Ruth threaded her needle with the efficiency of long practice. She let Nathan Caldwell take her to dinner in town Tuesday evening. Luke kept his eyes on the barn. "I heard. She came home very quiet." Ruth paused. Abigail Quiet isn't always the same as Abigail Content. You know the difference. He did know the difference. He had observed it closely enough over 8 years to understand that Abigail's quietness had textures. There was the comfortable quiet, the contemplative quiet, the guarded quiet. And then there was the particular quiet that came after something had reminded her of all the reasons she had stopped expecting much. "What did they talk about at dinner?" he asked before he could stop himself. Ruth smiled. "She didn't say." "I shouldn't have asked." "No, you probably shouldn't." Ruth resumed sewing. She laughed, though, when she came in. She laughed at something she said she'd remembered on the walk home, and when I asked what it was, she said, "Oh, never mind, it's nothing." You know what she does when she's thinking about someone who isn't in the room. Luke turned to look at her. "She laughs at things they said when they're not there to hear it." Ruth said simply, "She's been doing that with you for 6 years. The roof suddenly required his complete attention. He worked for 2 hours, replaced the rotted boards on the northeast corner, applied fresh tar pitch around the seams, and had most of his tools put away by the time Abigail came walking up the road from town. She stopped when she saw his wagon. He came around from behind the barn and met her in the yard. "Roof's fixed," he said. "Northeast corner was letting water in. Should hold through the fall." She looked at him, then up at the barn roof, then back at him. "You didn't have to." "I know." "Luke?" She set her school bag down on the porch rail. Her voice was tired but not unkind. Tired in the way a person gets when they are trying to hold a feeling steady and the feeling keeps pulling at its restraints. "What are you doing?" "Fixing your roof." "That's not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "What are you doing?" He understood what she was asking. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands. He had thought about this on the roof for 2 hours, and he still didn't have the clean, simple speech he wanted. He was not a man built for speeches. "I'm trying to show you," he said, "that I'm not going anywhere. I know that might not be worth much to you right now. I know you have no reason to take it seriously after—" He paused. "After years of me being around without being present. But I don't know how to say it in a way that counts, so I'm showing it instead. And I'll keep showing it until you either tell me to stop or until—" He stopped again. Until. Abigail looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her face. Something that had been very carefully locked began slowly to consider the question of whether it was still necessary to be locked. "Nathan asked me to dinner again," she said. "Saturday." "Are you going?" A pause. "I haven't decided." He nodded, put his hat back on. "All right," he said. "That's all. All right. What would you like me to say?" She looked at him with something that might in different circumstances have become exasperation. "I'd like you to say something real for once in your life, Luke Grayson." He met her eyes. "I don't want you to go," he said. The air between them changed. "I don't want you to go to dinner with Nathan Caldwell. I don't want you to choose a man who is easier to read because he's had less to lose. I want—" His voice was steadier than he expected. "I want you to give me a chance to show you what I actually mean. Not in words. Not in a big announcement. Just time. A little time." Abigail's expression was complicated. Not closed. Not open. Suspended in the difficult middle place where someone is weighing something real against something they've learned to be careful about. "You've had 8 years," she said quietly. "I know." He held her gaze. "And I wasted most of them. I'm asking you not to let my waste cost us both the rest." The word us landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. She picked up her school bag. "I'll think about it," she said. It was the same thing she'd said about Nathan's dinner invitation. But the way she said it was different. Less resigned, more considered. He walked to his wagon and climbed up. "Abigail." She turned. "Your mother says you laugh at things I said when I'm not around." Her face did something immediate and involuntary. A quick flash of unguarded surprise, followed by something softer. "My mother," she said, "talks too much." But she didn't deny it. And Luke Grayson drove home with the first genuine hope he'd allowed himself in a long, long time. Fragile as new wood, stubborn as roots, and more honest than anything he'd said in years. He didn't sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness. Not the restless, bruised kind that had kept him awake since the wagon wheel. Something more alert, more awake to possibility. He lay there and thought about what Caleb had said. The decision gets made for you, and understood that he was still in a race. He had entered late and was running in boots too heavy with years of silence. Nathan Caldwell was not a villain. That was the complicated part. If Nathan had been cruel or dishonest or predatory, the situation would have been simple. Luke could have simply been the man standing between Abigail and something bad. That was a role he understood. But Nathan was none of those things. From what Luke could tell, Nathan Caldwell was a decent, successful, confident man who saw Abigail Harper clearly and wanted her honestly. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply arrived at the moment when Luke's silence had created a vacancy. And the hardest thing Luke had to reckon with was this: he couldn't be angry at Nathan for walking through a door that Luke himself had left open. He could only decide finally whether he was going to walk through it first. Saturday came. He rode into town in the afternoon on legitimate business. He actually did need to pick up feed, and he was not looking for Abigail. He was specifically not looking for her. He saw her anyway. She was outside the hotel with Nathan Caldwell, and they were laughing at something, and Nathan had his hand lightly on the small of her back, the way a man does when he is comfortable with a woman and is beginning to assume that comfort is mutual. Abigail was not leaning into it. Luke noticed that. He noticed it with the careful, unwilling attention of a man who is trying very hard to be fair and is finding fairness costs more than he budgeted. She was not leaning away from it either. She was simply there, present, pleasant giving, the moment her characteristic courtesy, but there was a quality to her composure that he recognized. The same composure she had on that road after she said, "Has no man ever stayed?" The quality of a woman who is thinking about something else while performing the correct social response to the situation in front of her. He picked up his feed and rode home. He told himself it was fine. He told himself he had said what he needed to say, and now it was in her hands, and he would respect that. He told himself a lot of things on the way home. But when he unsaddled his horse and sat down on his own porch in the long June evening, he thought about Ruth Harper's voice saying she laughs at things you said when you're not there. And he thought about the word us landing between them, and he thought about Abigail's face in that unguarded moment of surprise. And he thought she is deciding. She is weighing something, and she has not decided yet, and whatever she decides is going to be real, because she is Abigail, and she doesn't do anything halfway. He had maybe days. He had maybe less. And the question he had to answer, the only one that mattered, was whether the man he was right now was the man worth choosing. He was going to find out. The answer came sooner than he expected, and from a direction he hadn't anticipated. It was June Reed who told him on a Tuesday morning, when she stopped by his property on her way back from town, ostensibly to return a borrowed pot. But actually, as Luke had learned over years of knowing June to deliver information, she had decided he needed whether he had asked for it or not. "Nathan Caldwell is staying," June said, setting the pot on his porch rail. "Took a room at the hotel for the month. Says he's considering investing in the valley. Cattle operation possibly. George Whitmore is already talking to him about the Henderson Creek parcel." Luke was splitting wood. He kept splitting wood. "That's so," he said. "He's been to see Abigail 3 times this week." June folded her hands. Clara Mason told me he brought her mother flowers on his last visit. Ruth apparently thought this was very fine. The axe came down. Ruth has opinions about most things, Luke said. Ruth Harper, June said carefully, has been watching her daughter be alone for 6 years and would like very much for that to change before she is too old to enjoy the grandchildren. A pause. Her words, not mine. Luke set another log on the block. What do you want me to say, June? I don't want you to say anything. I want you to do something. She picked up her pot. Before the man from Denver does it for you. She left. Luke split wood for another 20 minutes after she was gone, working through the frustration, the way he worked through most things that bothered him physically, methodically, until his arms ached enough that his mind had to quiet down. Then he leaned the axe against the block, went inside, washed his hands, and sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of him. He was not a letter-writing man. He had never in his adult life written a letter to a woman. He had barely managed the one to his mother, and Abigail had helped him with that. He sat there for a long time. Then he wrote 4 words. Can we talk? Sunday. He folded it and rode to town, and left it with Martha Greer to pass to Abigail, because writing directly to the Harper farm and handing her a 4-word note felt like something he couldn't quite manage, without knowing first whether she would read it as the thing it was, and asking, reaching a man, finally doing the thing he should have done years ago, or whether she would read it as something she'd already heard too many versions of. Martha took the note without comment, which told him she already knew everything and had simply been waiting for him to catch up. Sunday came slowly. He went to church, sat 3 rows behind Abigail and her mother, the way he always did, and watched Nathan Caldwell sit 2 seats down from the Harpers in the same pew. That was new. It was a small thing, a single pew, a couple of feet of proximity, but in Dry Creek Valley, where everyone knew exactly where everyone else sat, and what it meant when that changed. It was not small at all. Mrs. Patterson noticed. He could tell by the angle of her head. Caleb noticed. He caught Luke's eye from across the aisle and gave him the flat, patient look of a man watching someone else make a mistake in slow motion. After the service, while people gathered outside in the familiar Sunday ritual of conversation and catching up, Nathan Caldwell stood beside Abigail with the ease of a man who had decided he belonged there and was waiting for the world to agree. He shook hands with people. He laughed at the right moments. He asked old Mr. Henderson about his cattle operation with what appeared to be genuine interest. He was good at this. Luke had to admit that. He was watching from near the fence when Abigail found him. She came across the yard with the particular directness she used when she had decided to do something, and was committed to seeing it through before she could talk herself out of it. She stopped in front of him and said without preamble, "Sunday at 2, I'll be at home." Then she walked back. Luke spent the rest of Sunday morning pretending to be interested in what Caleb was saying about his north pasture. He arrived at the Harper farm at 5 minutes before 2. Ruth met him at the door with her mending under one arm and a look on her face that communicated several things simultaneously: pleasure at seeing him, awareness of what was at stake, and the quiet dignity of a woman who was going to give them privacy, while remaining close enough to the situation to care about the outcome. "She's on the back porch," Ruth said. "I'm going to visit Mrs. Alvarez." She took her mending and left with the deliberate efficiency of someone removing themselves from a scene they had been hoping for. Abigail was sitting on the back porch steps, the ones he had replaced, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. She didn't turn when she heard him come around the corner. She already knew it was him. He sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, the same step. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Nathan asked me a question last night," Abigail said. Luke's chest tightened. "What question?" "He asked me if there was someone else." She paused. "He said he was a direct man, and he preferred to know what he was walking into." Luke said nothing. He waited. "I told him I didn't know," she said. He looked at her profile. "What did he say to that?" "He said he appreciated the honesty." and that he was willing to wait a reasonable amount of time for me to figure it out, but that he was not willing to wait indefinitely. She turned and looked at Luke directly. He gave me a week. A week. The word sat between them with all its weight. He's a decisive man, Luke said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. He is. Abigail's eyes didn't leave his face. I want you to understand something, Luke. Nathan has done nothing wrong. He has been kind and honest and straightforward, and he has not made me a single promise he doesn't intend to keep. I know that because I asked him directly, and I watched his face when he answered. I know that, Luke said. I'm not asking you to think badly of him. I know you're not. She looked down at her hands. That's actually what makes this harder. He waited. If he were the wrong kind of man, she said quietly, this would be simple. I'd say no, and that would be the end of it. But he isn't. He's a good man who sees me clearly and wants something real. She paused. And I am 32 years old, with a mother who is getting older, and a life that I have held together by myself for long enough that I'm not sure I still know how to hold it together with someone else. Something in her voice broke open just slightly on the last words, not dramatically. The way old wood breaks quietly along a grain line that had been there for years. Luke turned to look at her fully. Abigail, he said. Look at me. She did. I know I'm late, he said. I know that. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I handled the last 8 years well because I didn't. I was careful when I should have been brave. I was respectful when I should have been honest. I told myself I was protecting what we had, but what I was actually doing was protecting myself. His voice was low but steady, and I am sorry for that, genuinely. She didn't look away. That's the first time, she said softly, that you've ever apologized for it. I know. Do you understand what it cost me? Her voice was still quiet, but there was something in it now, something real and sharp. The kind of thing that had been living beneath the patience and the composure for years. Do you understand what it is to watch someone who... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. To wonder every single time whether this is the moment he'll say it, whether this conversation will be the one, and then watch it not be, again and again. She exhaled. That kind of waiting changes a person, Luke. It teaches you to stop expecting, and once you've learned that lesson well enough, you can't always unlearn it just because someone finally decided to show up. He sat with that. He didn't rush past it. He didn't try to fix it or argue it down. He let it land the way it deserved to land, fully without deflection. You're right, he said. All of that is true. A silence. So, what do you want me to do with that? She asked. And her voice was not angry. It was tired in the way that only comes from caring about something for a very long time. I want you to let me prove that the man who shows up now is not the same man who kept not showing up before, he said. That's all I'm asking. Not a decision, not a promise from you. Just don't close the door on the basis of what I didn't do before I knew better. Abigail looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she said something that cracked him right open. I used to practice, she said quietly. What I would say. If you ever... I used to walk home from school some evenings and practice what I would tell you if you said anything real. I had it all worked out, what I'd say, how I'd say it. She shook her head slightly. I stopped doing that about 2 years ago. Why? She met his eyes. Because I decided I was done, she said simply. Not done with you. Done waiting for something that wasn't coming. Luke felt that in his sternum, the particular place where the truth lands when it's too accurate to be deflected anywhere else. And now, he said. She looked at him steadily. And now I don't know, she said. And I'm not sure I trust myself to know because I've wanted this for long enough that I'm afraid I can't evaluate it clearly anymore. She paused. I'm afraid I'll say yes because I want to, and not because I should. What would make it a should? he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Time, she said finally. Consistency. You being who you're being right now, not because you're scared of losing me to someone else, but because it's who you actually are. She looked at him. Can you tell me honestly that Nathan Caldwell has nothing to do with why you're finally sitting here saying these things? He opened his mouth, and he stopped. Because she deserved honesty more than she deserved comfort, and the honest answer was complicated. Nathan has something to do with it, he said. I won't lie to you about that. Watching him walk across that barn and hand you flowers, it woke me up in a way that I'm not proud needed waking. He held her gaze. But here's what's also true. What I feel about you was never about him. It was never about anyone else. It's been about you and my own fear for 8 years, and I would have gotten here eventually whether Nathan Caldwell existed or not. He paused. He just made eventually into now. Abigail looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not resolved, not decided, but softer. The way a fist opens, not because the danger has passed, but because the person has decided slowly to consider that it might. I haven't given Nathan an answer, she said. I know. I haven't given you one either. I know that too. She looked out at the yard. The afternoon was long and warm and the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. My mother likes you, she said. I know, I like her too. She told me last week that the smartest thing she ever did was marry a man who fixed things without being asked. A pause. She was talking about my father. But she looked at me when she said it. Luke said nothing, but something in him went very, very still. I'm not saying yes, Abigail said. I know. And I'm not saying no. I know that too. She stood, smoothed her skirt, looked at him with those clear eyes that always saw more than he was comfortable with. Come to supper Thursday, she said. My mother will make too much food and talk too much, and you'll have to endure it. I can endure that. I know you can. The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. Not quite, but close. 6:30. She went inside. Luke sat on those porch steps he had built and breathed for the first time all afternoon. He came Thursday at 6:30 with a jar of honey from his own hives and a quietly hammering heart. Ruth Harper opened the door and looked at the honey and looked at him and said, Well, it's about time, in the tone of a woman addressing a situation that has been obvious to everyone except the people in it. Supper was loud and warm. Ruth talked. She told stories about Abigail's childhood, about the valley's history, about her husband William, who had built the farm and left it to the two of them when he died too young. She talked about the school and the neighbors and the summer Abigail had organized the whole valley to help the Brennan family after their barn fire, and how Abigail had done it all without taking any credit. Abigail sat across from Luke and ate her supper, and occasionally looked at her mother with the patient affection of someone who has long since made peace with being discussed as though she isn't in the room. But she also once caught Luke's eye during one of Ruth's longer stories, and held it for a second longer than was strictly necessary. And in that second something was said that neither of them could have put into words. After supper, Ruth found a sudden and pressing need to check on something in her bedroom, and did not return for the remainder of the evening, which surprised no one. Luke helped Abigail clear the table. They worked alongside each other in the easy rhythm they had always had, the proximity comfortable, and also now something else. Something more charged. The awareness of a changed thing, unnamed but present. He came by the school today, Abigail said, stacking plates. Luke didn't ask who. What did he say? He said he was extending his timeline. She handed him a plate to dry. He said he'd spoken to George Whitmore about the Henderson Creek land, and he was seriously considering staying in the valley, making it permanent. Luke dried the plate. And that changes things, he asked carefully. It changes the nature of the question. She handed him another plate. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands were precise in the way they got when she was managing something internal. He's not a passing opportunity anymore. He's a real one. A man with plans and land and a future that he is actively building here. Luke set the plate down. Abigail. She kept her hands busy. Look at me, he said. She looked up. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I know I've let years pass without proving that. I know the word of a man who was silent for 8 years doesn't buy much. But I need you to understand that what Nathan Caldwell is building is real estate. What I'm talking about is different. What I'm talking about is... He stopped, because the word he was reaching for was not a careful word, and it was not a word he had ever said out loud to a woman, and it was sitting right there on the edge of his tongue, and the responsible thing was probably to wait to give her time to not rush the thing. Say it, Abigail said quietly. He looked at her. Whatever you're not saying, she said, say it. He put down the dish towel. I love you, he said. I have loved you for years, and I was too afraid to say it, and I'm saying it now because it's true, and because you deserve to make whatever decision you're going to make with all the information, not just the parts I was comfortable giving you. The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail stood with her hands at her sides, and her eyes on his face, and her expression was unreadable. Not closed, not open. Something in the middle that he couldn't translate. Then she said very quietly, When? He blinked. What? When did you know? He thought about it honestly. The winter your father died, he said. You came to church alone for the first time, and you sat exactly where you always sat, and you kept your chin up the whole service. And afterward, you thanked everyone who offered condolences with more grace than most people manage on a good day. He paused. And I stood there watching you and thought there is nobody in this valley like her. And I didn't do a thing about it. Abigail's jaw moved slightly. That was 6 years ago, she said. I know. She looked away, looked back. I need to think, she said. I know. I need... She pressed a hand briefly to her forehead. I need to not be standing in my kitchen right now because I cannot think clearly in my kitchen. Should I go? She looked at him. Not yet, she said. They finished the dishes in silence, but it was a different silence again, the kind that comes after something real has been said and is settling into the space, finding its level like water. And Luke Grayson stood in Abigail Harper's kitchen and dried her dishes and was more terrified than he had ever been in his life, and more certain at the same time that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Nathan Caldwell had a week. Luke had tonight and tomorrow and whatever came after, and he intended to spend every moment of it being the man he should have been years ago. He didn't hear from her Friday. He told himself that was fine. She had asked for time to think, and time to think meant exactly that time. He was not going to show up at the school. He was not going to ride past the farm on some invented errand. He was going to give her what she asked for, and trust that the words he had finally said were real enough to hold their own ground without him standing over them. He fixed his north fence line. He mended tack that didn't strictly need mending. He cooked supper and ate it alone and washed the plate and went to bed at a reasonable hour, like a man who was managing himself with dignity. He was not managing himself with dignity. He was managing himself with sheer stubbornness, which is a different thing entirely, but it produced similar results. Saturday morning, Caleb appeared at his fence line again, with no stated purpose, and a cup of coffee he'd clearly brought from home. Well, Caleb said. Well, what? Don't do that. Caleb drank his coffee. June heard from Clara Mason that Abigail turned down Nathan Caldwell's dinner invitation Friday night. Luke's hands went still on the fence wire. She what? Sent word she wasn't available. Caleb's expression was carefully neutral. Clara didn't know why. Just that Nathan was seen eating alone at the hotel and looking like a man recalculating his plans. Luke went back to the fence wire. His heart was doing something complicated. That doesn't mean anything necessarily, he said. No, Caleb agreed. Could mean a dozen things. A pause. Could also mean exactly what it sounds like. I told her I love her Thursday night. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, about time, in the same tone Ruth Harper had used about the honey, and drank his coffee. Sunday church was an exercise in controlled composure. Abigail sat in her usual pew. Nathan Caldwell sat across the aisle this week, not 2 seats down from her, a shift so slight that most people wouldn't notice. But in Dry Creek Valley, it was a billboard. Mrs. Patterson noticed. June noticed. Caleb noticed and looked at Luke with his eyebrows slightly raised. Luke looked straight ahead at the pulpit and concentrated on the sermon. Afterward in the yard, he was talking to old Mr. Henderson about the Henderson Creek parcel, the land Nathan had reportedly been considering, when he felt someone step up beside him. He knew it was her before he turned. He had some kind of unreasonable internal awareness of Abigail Harper's proximity that he had long since stopped pretending was normal. "Mr. Henderson," she said warmly. "How is Mrs. Henderson's knee? Complaining?" Henderson said cheerfully, "Same as always." She laughed. Then she turned to Luke, and her eyes were clear and direct, and doing that thing they did when she had made a decision and was walking toward it. "Come to the farm this afternoon," she said quietly. 3 o'clock. "All right," he said. She nodded once and walked to her mother, and Luke spent the next 3 hours being technically present in his own life, while his mind was entirely somewhere else. He arrived at 2:55. Ruth Harper opened the door, looked at him and said, "She's at the cottonwood." Then she went back inside, and the door closed gently behind her. Luke walked around the side of the house, through the yard, past the barn he had re-roofed, and across the stretch of open ground toward the old cottonwood that stood near the creek line at the back of the Harper property. It was enormous and ancient, the kind of tree that had been old when Abigail's father was young, and it was the place where the Harpers had always gathered for the conversations that mattered. Abigail was standing with her back against its trunk, her arms loosely crossed, her face turned slightly toward the creek. She heard him coming and turned. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Abigail said, "I've been out here for an hour." Thinking. She looked at him. "I walked out here after church, and I stood in this exact spot, and I thought about every conversation I've had in the last 2 weeks, and every conversation I've had in the last 8 years, and what I actually want my life to look like." She paused. "And I thought about what my father told me once the year before he died." Luke waited. He said the hardest thing about loving someone wasn't the feeling. The feeling was the easy part. He said the hardest thing was deciding on an ordinary Tuesday morning when nothing was romantic or dramatic to keep choosing that person. Her voice was steady but not untouched. "He said your mother and I don't have a great love story. We have 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays, and I chose her in every single one." Luke said nothing. He let her finish. "I've been waiting," Abigail said, "for someone to choose me on an ordinary Tuesday, not in a barn with flowers. Not when a better option appeared and made him realize what he had." She looked at him with something direct and honest and a little bit raw. "I need to know, Luke, if what you're feeling right now is real on the ordinary Tuesdays. Not just this one." "I understand that," he said, "and I can't prove it to you in a single afternoon. I know that. What I can tell you is that every time I did something ordinary in the last 8 years, every fence I mended every morning, I rode through this valley every Sunday, I sat 3 rows behind you in that church you were part of, how I understood my own life. Not as a fantasy, not as something I was waiting for, just as part of it." He exhaled. "The ordinary Tuesdays already had you in them. I was just too afraid to say so out loud." Abigail's arms, still crossed, shifted slightly. Not opening fully, but adjusting. "Nathan came to see me Friday morning," she said. Luke kept his expression steady. "I heard you didn't take his dinner invitation." "I didn't." She looked down briefly. "He came to the school before I left for the day. He was gracious about it. He said he'd been watching things, and he wasn't a man who liked competing for something that wasn't available to be won." She paused. "He was very decent about the whole thing." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was sorry for taking his time. He said don't be. He said he'd rather know the truth early than a comfortable lie later." She looked up. "He's a good man, Luke. I want you to know I know that. I know he is." I'm not telling you this to make you feel that you won something, she said carefully. I'm telling you because I need you to understand what I'm choosing and what I'm not choosing. I'm not saying no to Nathan because of some dramatic realization. I'm saying no to Nathan because... She stopped. Her voice did something small and controlled. Because I have been half in love with you since the winter my father died, and I cannot in good conscience build something real with another man while that is true. The cottonwood was very quiet. Luke looked at her and felt something. He didn't have a word for. Relief was too small. Gratitude was too formal. Joy was too light for what was actually moving through him. It was something older and more structural than any of those things. You've known since then, he said. I've known since then, she said. And I am furious at you for making me know it alone for 6 years, and I need you to understand that before we go any further. Okay, he said. I'm serious. I know you are. You should be. He held her gaze. You're right to be. She looked at him for a moment, assessing whether he meant it. He meant it completely. I also need you to understand something else, she said. I am not a simple woman. My life is not simple. My mother needs real care, and that is not going to change. It's going to become more demanding. I run a school. I have obligations in this community that I take seriously, and I am not going to abandon them because I have a husband. I have opinions that I will express, and a temper that comes out occasionally when something is genuinely wrong. And I have spent enough years swallowing both that I am done doing that. I know all of that, Luke said. Do you know it the way a man knows a fact, or do you know it the way a man knows something he's actually prepared to live with? He almost smiled. The second one. Because there's a difference. There is, and I mean the second one. She looked at him, and for the first time in the whole conversation, something in her expression released. Not dissolved Abigail Harper's composure, never simply dissolved, but released. The way a held breath releases. The way a thing that has been braced against impact slowly realizes the impact isn't what it feared. I stopped practicing what I would say to you, she said quietly. 2 years ago. I told you that. You did. I don't have anything prepared. Her voice was softer now. I've been standing here for an hour, and I couldn't work out a single prepared thing, which probably tells you something about where I actually am with all of this. It tells me something, he agreed. What does it tell you? He looked at her. Really looked at her the same way he'd looked at her beside that wagon wheel 2 weeks ago that started all of this. Except this time, he wasn't startled by what he saw. This time, he recognized it fully, without the shock of someone who has been avoiding a mirror. It tells me you're not performing anything, he said. It tells me what's happening right now is real. She pressed her lips together briefly. Her eyes were bright. Not crying, Abigail wasn't a crier, hadn't been as long as he'd known her, but bright in the way eyes get when something that has been held very tightly is finally being set down. I'm still angry at you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. I'm going to be angry at you for a while. That's fair. And you're going to have to earn this. It isn't going to be handed to you because you finally showed up and said the right things. I don't expect it to be. Good. She uncrossed her arms. Because I have very high standards and a long memory, and I will not pretend otherwise to make this easier. I wouldn't want you to. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, Come inside. My mother made too much food again. He fell into step beside her. They walked back toward the farmhouse through the long afternoon, and for the first time in 8 years, the distance between them felt like something that had been resolved rather than something being carefully maintained. Luke, she said as they reached the porch steps. Yeah. When you said it Thursday, I love you, were you afraid? He thought about it honestly. Terrified, he said. She nodded slowly like this was the right answer. Good, she said. That means it was real. She went inside. He stood on the steps he had built and breathed, and for the second time in recent memory, allowed himself something he was not accustomed to hope clean and unqualified, and right out in the open, not hidden anywhere. Ruth Harper served supper with the barely contained satisfaction of a woman whose most important long-running project had just moved into its final phase. She asked Luke questions about his cattle and his property, with the interest of someone who was mentally noting capacity and logistics, and she told a long story about her husband's proposal that was clearly meant as a form of emotional instruction, and that both Luke and Abigail listened to with different degrees of the same attentiveness. After supper, Ruth retired early, emphatically pointedly, with a meaningful glance at the parlor, and Luke and Abigail sat in the front room with the lamp turned low and talked. Not about decisions or timelines, or Nathan Caldwell, or the future. Just talked the way they had always talked, when the pressure was off easily, honestly, with the specific comfort of two people who had known each other long enough that silence between sentences was not an absence, but a presence. He told her about the winter his father died years before she moved to the valley, and how he had built his cabin partially to have something to do with his grief. She told him about the first year of teaching, how terrified she had been, that she didn't know enough, and how she had stayed up until midnight every night for 3 months preparing the next day's lessons. He told her about the Sunday 4 years ago when he had made up his mind to say something had actually ridden toward her farm with the intention of telling her, and turned back at the property line because he convinced himself the timing was wrong. She looked at him when he told her that. "Which Sunday?" she asked. He thought. "End of October, after the harvest dance." She was quiet for a moment. "I wore the green dress to that dance," she said. "I remember. I wore that dress because—" She stopped. Then with the careful honesty she applied to everything. "I wore it because I'd read somewhere that green was a color that suited dark hair, and I thought—" A pause. "Never mind." "You thought I might notice," he said. Her chin lifted slightly, not denying it. "I noticed," he said. "You didn't say anything." "No, I didn't." He looked at her. "I went home and turned my horse around at your property line and told myself the timing was wrong. And it wasn't the timing. It was me." She looked at him steadily. "Do you know how many green dresses that is?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "Over the years." Her voice was composed, but her eyes had something both wounded and wry in them. "I had 2 green dresses. I wore them to every occasion that seemed like one where you might I just—" She stopped, shook her head slightly. "I'm telling you this because I need you to understand the full scope of what your silence cost, and I'm only able to say it now because you finally said something first." The lamp burned quietly between them. "Abigail," he said, "don't apologize again." "I wasn't going to." He leaned forward. "I was going to say that I see it. All of it. And I'm not going to look away from how much I got wrong. And I'm going to spend whatever time you give me making sure you never have to wear a color to be noticed again." She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, short and sudden, and a little helpless, the kind that comes when something is both painful and absurd enough that only laughter fits. "That," she said when it settled, "is the most Luke Grayson thing you have ever said to me." "Is that good?" She considered him. "Yes," she said quietly. "Actually, it is." He left at 9 o'clock because that was proper, and Ruth Harper's lights were out, and the evening had already given them both more than either had known how to expect. At the door, Abigail stood with her hand on the frame and looked at him in the low light. "Tomorrow," she said. "Don't come over on some invented errand." "I won't." "Just come." He looked at her. "What time?" "After school, 4 o'clock." "All right." He stepped off the porch, turned back once. Abigail. She was still in the doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for not closing the door before I figured out I should have been knocking." She was quiet for a moment. "I almost did," she said honestly. "A few times." "I know. But I couldn't quite make myself do it." She paused. "I think I knew somewhere that you'd eventually get out of your own way." She closed the door. And Luke Grayson walked to his horse in the dark with the particular lightness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that the moment it's finally set down, his whole body doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of the weight. He rode home slowly, letting his horse choose the pace. The valley was dark and cool and full of the sounds of summer moving into itself. Crickets, the distant creek, the occasional passage of something in the grass. He had ridden this valley 10,000 times. He knew every road, every property line, every fence post that needed attention along the route. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something. And for a man who had spent 8 years standing at the beginning without stepping through that difference, was everything. He was at her gate at 4 o'clock the next afternoon. Not 4:05, not 3:55. 4 o'clock exactly, because Abigail Harper was a woman who meant what she said, and he was from this point forward a man who was going to demonstrate that he understood the difference between showing up and showing up on time. She was already on the porch when he arrived. She had changed out of her school clothes into a simpler dress, and she had a cup of tea in both hands, and she was watching him come through the gate with an expression that was carefully neutral, except for the very slight thing happening at the corners of her mouth. "You're punctual," she said. "I'm motivated," he said. She almost smiled. "Come sit." He sat beside her on the steps. His steps, the ones he had built which he was choosing not to point out, and she handed him the second cup of tea, which meant she had made it for him, which meant she had expected him to be on time, which meant something he filed carefully away. They sat for a moment without talking. Then Abigail said, "Nathan left this morning." Luke turned to look at her. "He came by the school to say goodbye," she said. "He was very proper about it. He said he'd decided the Henderson Creek parcel wasn't the right investment and that he was heading back to Denver." She paused. "He shook my hand. He said he hoped I'd be happy." "Are you sorry he's gone?" Luke asked. He asked it honestly, not defensively. She thought about it with the same honesty. "No," she said. "I'm sorry he spent time here that didn't come to anything. He deserved better than being the man who arrived at the wrong moment." She looked at her tea. "But I'm not sorry he's gone." "Good," Luke said. "That's all? Just good. What would you like me to say?" She looked at him sideways. "Something that tells me you're not going to spend the next 20 years being quietly smug about Nathan Caldwell." He kept his expression straight. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Luke Grayson. I'm a very humble man." She laughed that same sudden real laugh from the night before that he realized completely devoted to producing as often as possible. It occurred to him that making Abigail Harper laugh was something he had been doing carefully and occasionally for 8 years, without understanding it was one of the most important things he did. He understood it now. "I want to ask you something," he said when the laughter settled. She looked at him. "All right. When I turned my horse around at your property line that October, the harvest dance, the green dress, what were you doing that evening, after the dance?" She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "I want to know." She looked at her cup. "I sat on this porch," she said, "with my mother. We drank tea, and she asked me how the dance was, and I said it was fine, and she asked if anything interesting had happened, and I said no." A pause. "And then she went inside, and I sat out here by myself for a while." "Doing what?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Hoping," she said finally, "that I'd hear a horse coming up the road." The word landed between them with the weight of every year it represented. Luke set his cup down on the step. "I'm sorry," he said, "not as an apology that closes the subject, as a thing I mean and will keep meaning." She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I believe you." "That's new," he said. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "It is." He came back Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday he fixed the latch on the paddock gate that had been giving trouble, and Friday he brought firewood that she didn't strictly need yet, but would by October, and Saturday he stayed for supper again, And afterward, he and Abigail sat on the porch until the stars came out fully and talked about things they had never talked about before. Not the careful peripheral conversation of two people managing a friendship. The real conversation. The kind where you say things you haven't said to another person, and you watch their face while you say them, and you discover that being known by someone doesn't diminish you the way you always feared it might. He told her about the loneliness of the ranch. Not the practical loneliness of a man living alone, but the deeper kind. The specific absence of someone who knew your interior life, who understood the shape of your thoughts without needing everything explained. She told him about the years after her father died when she had carried the farm and her mother and the school all at once, and how she had learned to need very little because needing things and not having them turned out to be worse than simply adjusting your expectations downward. "That's a terrible thing to learn," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." "You don't have to keep that adjustment," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him in the dark of the porch. "I'm working on believing that," she said honestly. "Take your time," he said. "I'll still be here." She turned back to the stars, but she moved almost imperceptibly slightly closer to him on the bench. He noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. 3 weeks into what Dry Creek Valley had collectively, silently, and without announcement, decided to call the new situation, Caleb Reed found Luke replacing the hinges on his barn door and delivered his assessment with characteristic efficiency. "You look different," Caleb said. "I look the same." "You look like a man who's sleeping." Luke tested the door hinge. "I'm sleeping fine." "That's what I mean." Caleb leaned against the barn wall. "You haven't slept properly in years. Any fool could see it. June said she noticed it too, said you had the look of a man carrying something heavy every day." He paused. "You don't have that look anymore." Luke didn't say anything. "June also says Abigail Harper hummed while she was at the store Tuesday," Caleb added. "June can't remember the last time that happened." Luke fit the second hinge into place and tried to keep his expression level, and probably failed. "We're taking it slowly," he said. "Of course you are." Caleb picked up a nail from the box without being asked and held it in position for Luke to hammer. "How slowly?" "At her pace." "Good answer." Another nail. "You going to ask her?" Luke hammered the nail. "When the time is right," he said. "And when is that?" He thought about Abigail's face by the cottonwood tree, the way she had said, "I need to know if what you're feeling right now is real on the ordinary Tuesdays." He thought about all the ordinary Tuesdays he had spent in the last 3 weeks, and how none of them had felt like work. How showing up had turned out to be the easiest thing he had done in years once he had stopped being afraid to do it. "Soon," he said. Caleb handed him the next nail. "Good," he said. The question of when became answered as most important things are not by planning, but by the specific weight of a particular moment making itself known. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late August, 6 weeks after the conversation at the cottonwood tree. He had come to the farm after his morning work as he did most days now, and Abigail had been sitting at the kitchen table going over the school accounts for the coming year with the focused expression she wore when numbers were involved and the numbers were not cooperating. He made coffee without being asked. He had learned where everything was, by now had learned the particular preferences of the Harper kitchen, the way you learn the preferences of a place you intend to belong to, and set a cup beside her elbow, and sat across from her, and read the 3-week-old newspaper that lived on the end of the table. Ruth was in the front room with her mending. The house was quiet and warm and ordinary. Outside, the late summer afternoon was doing what late summer afternoons do. And Luke looked up from the newspaper at Abigail, who was frowning at a column of figures with her pencil pressed to her lower lip, and he felt something so complete and uncomplicated move through him that it was almost disorienting. This was it, not the big dramatic version of it, not the version with flowers in a barn and an audience watching. Just this, a kitchen, a cup of coffee, a woman he loved doing ordinary work at a table while he read a 3-week-old newspaper and the absolute structural certainty that he wanted this to be his life. Not eventually. Now. He put the newspaper down. "Abigail," he said. She was still looking at the accounts. "Look up for a second." She looked up. He wasn't prepared. He had no speech. He had no ring. That realization arrived half a second after he opened his mouth, and he noted it with the detached clarity of a man past the point of reconsidering. "I want to marry you," he said. The kitchen was very still. Abigail's pencil stopped moving. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I didn't plan this. I was sitting here reading about last month's cattle prices, and I looked at you, and He stopped. "I want this to be my life. I want you to be my life. Not someday. I want to ask you now in your kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, when nothing is romantic or dramatic, because your father was right about ordinary Tuesdays, and I want 1,000 of them with you. So." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me?" Abigail put her pencil down very carefully. From the front room, with the perfect timing of a woman who had been listening to every word through the thin farmhouse wall, Ruth Harper made a sound that was either a gasp or a quiet sob, and was almost certainly both. Abigail looked at the doorway to the front room, then back at Luke. "My mother," she said, "has the worst timing." "Or the best," Luke said. Her mouth curved. The real smile, the full one, the one she didn't deploy carefully, and that made everything else in the room less important. "The ring matters less than you think," she said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, across the coffee cups and the school accounts, and the years of ordinary Tuesdays that were just beginning, and her eyes were bright and clear and absolutely certain. "Yes," she said. "It is." From the front room, Ruth Harper said, "Oh, thank God," with the relieved exhaustion of someone who has been waiting on a specific outcome for 6 years. And both Abigail and Luke laughed at exactly the same time. And it was the best sound the Harper kitchen had ever held. He rode into town the next morning and came back with a ring from the jeweler in Millhaven, a simple band with a small garnet, because Abigail had once said in passing that she found diamonds ostentatious, and that she preferred color, and he had remembered that the way he had apparently been remembering everything about her for years without realizing he was doing it. He gave it to her on the porch steps. She held it for a moment. Then she looked up at him with something unguarded on her face, the kind of look that is a person at their most real, without any of the careful management that life teaches you to apply to your own expressions. "It's exactly right," she said. He put it on her finger. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I'm going to be difficult to live with. I know. I have opinions about everything. I've noticed. I correct people when they're wrong, including you, and I'm not going to stop doing that." "Good," he said. "I need it." She studied him. "You're not worried about any of this?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about it. "Because everything you're describing is just you," he said. "And I spent 8 years watching you from a careful distance, and I know exactly who you are. I'm not marrying an idea. I'm marrying the person who wore 2 green dresses for 6 years on the hope that a fool would eventually notice." He paused. "I noticed. I was just late." Her throat moved. "You're never allowed to tell anyone about the green dresses," she said. "Absolutely not." He agreed. She pressed her lips together, but the smile came anyway, and she turned her face slightly to hide it, the way she did when something had gotten past her guard. And Luke Grayson watched her do it, and felt something settle in him, so deep it reached places that had been unsettled for years. They were married in October, when the valley had gone gold, and the mornings had the particular chill that comes before the real cold sets in. The wedding was small, because that was what Abigail wanted, and what Abigail wanted was from this point forward what Luke considered first among all other considerations. The church was full anyway, because Dry Creek Valley had been invested in this outcome for years, and was not going to miss it on the basis of a mere desire for intimacy. Mrs. Patterson cried. Caleb Reed did not cry, but stood in the front row with the expression of a man who is not crying and is managing it with some effort. June Reed held Caleb's arm and cried openly and without apology. Ruth Harper sat in the front pew in her best dress and held a handkerchief she had embroidered herself for this occasion, which told Luke she had been more confident in the outcome than she had ever let on. Old Mr. Henderson, who had known the valley longer than most people had been alive, leaned over to his wife during the ceremony and said in a whisper, loud enough to carry 2 rows, "Took him long enough." His wife shushed him. He was not wrong. At the end of the ceremony, when Luke Grayson looked at Abigail Harper, Abigail Grayson, now a fact that was going to take both of them some time to adjust to, and that Ruth had already been practicing aloud. She was looking back at him with the clear, steady gaze that had undone him beside a wagon wheel 4 months ago, and that would, he was certain, continue to undo him at regular intervals for the rest of his life. He kissed her, and the small church made a sound of collective satisfaction, and somewhere in the back, one of Abigail's older students started to cry, which made all the other students uncomfortable, and made Abigail laugh against Luke's mouth, which was so specifically and perfectly her, that he had to pull back and look at her and confirm that this was real. It was real. The first Tuesday of their married life was unremarkable in every important way. Luke fixed the latch on the back door that had been giving trouble again. Abigail prepared her lesson plans for the week at the kitchen table. Ruth Harper sat in her chair in the front room and read, and occasionally said things that didn't require a response, and sometimes received one anyway. That evening, after supper, Luke and Abigail sat on the porch steps in the cooling October air. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They looked at the valley in the long, quiet dusk, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because neither of them needed to. "Luke," she said finally. "Yeah? You know what I was thinking about today?" "What?" "That afternoon by the wagon wheel." She paused. "When I said what I said." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too. Do you know what I was feeling when I said it?" She looked up at him. "I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to make you feel bad." "I know. I was just—" She searched for the word. "Done," she said. "Done pretending I wasn't waiting. Done carrying it alone." She settled back against his shoulder. "I just wanted to put it down somewhere outside of myself for once, even if nothing came of it." "Something came of it," he said. "Something came of it," she agreed. The valley went dark slowly, the way it does in autumn, with gradual dignity. Stars appeared one at a time, then all at once. Luke thought about a sentence he had said beside a fixed wagon wheel, meaning it as a simple truth about a remarkable woman not understanding. It was the first word of a conversation that would take 4 months and 8 years to complete. "Any man would be lucky to have you." He had said it and believed it. Now he was the man. And he understood, sitting on these steps with Abigail's weight against his shoulder and the cold autumn air coming in from the mountains, and the sound of Ruth Harper humming faintly inside, he understood with a completeness that went to the bone what the words had always actually meant. Lucky wasn't the half of it. Lucky was what you called it before you understood that some things were not luck at all, that they were choices made badly for years, and then finally made right, and that the difference between almost losing something and actually having it was in the end just one man deciding that being afraid was no longer a good enough reason to stay silent. He had been afraid. He had been silent. He and Abigail Harper had waited not indefinitely, not without cost, not without considering other roads, but long enough. Long enough for him to get out of his own way. Long enough for him to become finally the man who stayed. And that was the truest love story Dry Creek Valley ever told. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic declaration, but 2 people on an ordinary October evening on a porch in Wyoming, leaning into each other's warmth, having chosen and been chosen, belonging at last to the life they had almost let slip through their hands. This time, he was staying. This time, he had finally arrived.